damn it. Naomi, what on earth are you doing? Alexander Grant's voice cracked through the quiet like a whip, sharp and cutting. Naomi Reed didn't stir. She lay stretched on the thick Persian rug, her back stiff from hours of stillness, a thin wool blanket drawn halfway over her. Resting on her chest, baby Sophie Grant slept in perfect peace, one tiny hand curled into the black and white fabric of Naomi's maid's uniform. The warm amber light from 2 table lamps bathed the room in softness, but Alexander's voice stripped it away in an instant. He stood framed by the tall French doors, still in his charcoal suit, orange tie slightly askew, a leather briefcase dangling from one hand. His other hand was clenched into a fist. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His steps pounded against the polished wood as he advanced. Naomi cracked her eyes open, her voice low, rough with fatigue but steady. She finally fell asleep. "Please don't wake her." "Asleep? On you? On the floor?" His voice was thick with disbelief and irritation. "You're the maid, not her mother." Naomi adjusted the edge of the blanket over Sophie's shoulder, her movements slow and deliberate. "I tried everything. The crib, the rocker, walking her around. She only stopped crying when I held her like this." Alexander stopped just beside the rug, towering over them. His shadow cut across her face. "This is unacceptable," he said, bending slightly as if ready to lift Sophie away. The moment his hands touched the baby, Sophie's little face scrunched, a soft whimper escaping her lips. It sharpened into a cry, thin and rising fast. Naomi's eyes snapped fully open. "If you take her now, she'll scream for an hour. Is that what you want?" Their eyes locked. Alexander wasn't used to this, being challenged, especially by staff. His jaw worked, but pride wouldn't let him back down. He slid his arms under his daughter anyway, lifting her. Sophie's cry exploded into the room, shattering the fragile quiet. Her arms flailed, searching for the body that had been holding her. "Shoo, sweetheart, it's Daddy," Alexander murmured, trying to soothe her. The wail only grew. "Give her back," Naomi said, not loud, but with a firmness that froze him in place. "She's fine," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's terrified," Naomi countered. "You're scaring her." For a long moment, Alexander stood there, Sophie thrashing in his arms. Then something shifted, an almost imperceptible crack in his defiance. He lowered the baby back into Naomi's waiting embrace. The change was immediate. Sophie curled into Naomi's chest as if her small body remembered exactly where it belonged. Within seconds, the sobs shrank to hiccups, then faded into steady breaths. Naomi rocked her gently, humming under her breath without thinking. "I've got you, little one," she murmured. Alexander straightened, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered on them longer than he meant to. Mrs. Holloway, the housekeeper, appeared in the doorway, having heard the commotion. She took in the scene in one glance. "Sir," she said quietly, "the floor is where the crying stops." Alexander didn't reply. He adjusted his tie, still watching Naomi on the rug, the baby sleeping soundly in her arms. For reasons he couldn't name, he didn't speak again before turning and walking out, the air in the room colder in his absence. Naomi stayed where she was until Sophie's breathing deepened. Only then did she glance toward the door, exhaling slowly. She'd been in houses like this before, grand rooms, expensive furniture, people who believed care could be delegated like a task. But Sophie knew better, and so did she. The next evening, Alexander decided things would be different. He came home earlier than usual without announcing it. The mansion was quiet except for the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Naomi was in the kitchen, rinsing Sophie's tiny bottles, when she heard his footsteps on the marble. "Where is she?" His voice was brisk, all business. "In the nursery," Naomi replied, turning off the tap. She dried her hands slowly, watching him from the corner of her eye. Alexander nodded once and headed upstairs without another word. The nursery was immaculate. White crib, pale pink walls, a mobile of soft clouds hanging above. The faint scent of baby powder lingered in the air. Sophie was in Naomi's arms, still awake but relaxed. "I'll take her tonight," Alexander said, stepping forward. Naomi looked at him for a long moment before placing Sophie in his arms. Alright. She likes to be held close until her breathing slows. I can handle my own daughter, he said, adjusting Sophie against his chest. I never said you couldn't, Naomi replied, her tone even. Alexander moved to the crib and laid Sophie down, tucking the blanket neatly. At first, Sophie's wide blue eyes stared up at him, curious. He smiled faintly, brushing a hand over her tiny forehead. Then her lips began to tremble. A small sound escaped her throat, a warning more than a cry. She's fine, Alexander muttered, stepping back. The warning became a whimper. The whimper became a cry. And within 30 seconds, the cry became a full-throated wail that seemed to fill the entire room. Alexander's shoulders stiffened. She's just overtired. She'll settle. From the doorway, Naomi spoke softly. She's telling you something. She's tired, that's all, he shot back. For the next 15 minutes, Alexander tried everything, picking Sophie up, pacing the length of the nursery, bouncing her in his arms. He hummed, though it came out more like a low mutter than a tune. He rocked from side to side, his movements awkward and impatient. But Sophie's cries didn't ease. Her face flushed, tears rolling down her cheeks, her tiny hands clutching at nothing. Alexander glanced at the clock. It had been 20 minutes now, and the wails were unrelenting. A faint line of sweat formed at his temple, and his tie hung loose from when he'd tugged it earlier in frustration. Naomi stepped forward. May I? He hesitated, jaw tight. The idea of handing Sophie over felt like conceding defeat. But Sophie's cries were piercing now, her small chest heaving. Finally, he gave a sharp nod and passed her to Naomi. The transformation was instant. Naomi held Sophie against her shoulder, one hand gently cupping the baby's head, the other rubbing slow circles on her back. Her voice was low, rhythmic, almost like a hum and whisper blended together. It's all right, little one, you're safe, she murmured. Sophie's cries softened within seconds, her tiny fists unclenching. By the time Naomi lowered herself into the rocking chair, the baby's eyelids were heavy. Within a minute, Sophie was asleep, her cheek pressed into the curve of Naomi's neck. Alexander stood there, arms hanging at his sides. How do you do that? Naomi didn't look up. I listen. Something about her tone stopped him from saying more. It wasn't arrogance, it was simply fact. In the hallway, Mrs. Holloway lingered, pretending to straighten a vase of flowers. She had heard enough to know what had happened. As Alexander stepped out, she met his eyes. Sir, she said quietly, some people aren't comforted by titles or bloodlines. They're comforted by who shows up when they're scared. Alexander didn't reply. The truth of it landed heavier than he wanted to admit. He went straight to his study, poured himself a drink, and sank into the leather chair. The ice in his glass clinked faintly in the silence. But silence wasn't what he got. Down the hall, Naomi's gentle humming still carried, soft and steady, the sound of a calm that had nothing to do with him. He took a sip, staring at the wall, feeling something unfamiliar prick at him. It wasn't just that Sophie fell asleep in Naomi's arms. It was that, for the second night in a row, he'd been reminded that in his own house, he wasn't the one Sophie trusted most. Alexander wasn't used to losing. Not in the boardroom. Not in negotiations. Certainly not in his own home. But the next morning, as he descended the grand staircase, the memory of the night before was still lodged in his mind like a stone in his shoe. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the kitchen. Naomi stood at the counter, Sophie perched on her hip, holding a small plastic spoon in her chubby fist. The baby was laughing at something Naomi whispered. The sound hit Alexander in a way he didn't expect, light, unguarded, pure. He cleared his throat. Good morning. Naomi glanced over, polite but neutral. Morning, Mr. Grant. He stepped closer, adjusting his cufflinks as though the movement might buy him courage. About last night? Naomi didn't look up from spooning mashed banana into Sophie's eager mouth. Yes. I may have overreacted, he said, the words tasting foreign. She seemed to need you. Naomi's eyes finally met his. It's not about being right, Mr. Grant. It's about Sophie feeling safe. He bristled at the correction, but the firmness in her tone held him in place. I'm her father. I should be the one who can calm her. You can, Naomi said evenly. But right now, she knows my heartbeat. My voice. That's not a challenge to you, it's a bridge to you. Alexander frowned. A bridge? She'll cross it when she's ready, Naomi replied, wiping a bit of banana from Sophie's chin. But only if you don't burn it down by forcing her. The metaphor irritated him, mostly because it made sense. He opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Holloway stepped in with a tray of fresh croissants. Breakfast is in the sunroom, sir, she said with her usual calm efficiency. Alexander nodded, then looked back at Naomi. Fine. You try it your way. Naomi gave a small nod of acknowledgement, nothing more. In the sunroom, Alexander sat at the head of the long glass table, the morning light spilling over the manicured gardens beyond. He tried to read the paper, but every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the kitchen doorway. He could hear Naomi's voice, low, measured, reading something to Sophie. There was no rush in her words, no impatience. Just a steady, soothing rhythm. After breakfast, Alexander returned to his office. His morning schedule was full: calls, contracts, meetings. But at 11:15, a sound from the hall interrupted him. Sophie's cry. He stood, hesitated, then walked toward it. Naomi was in the nursery, holding Sophie against her shoulder, patting her back in slow, deliberate movements. The baby's cries were softening. Naomi looked over at him. Teething, she said simply. He stepped into the room. Can I try? She studied him for a moment, then shifted Sophie into his arms. He mimicked her slow patting, trying to keep his voice low and steady. It's okay, sweetheart. Daddy's here. For a moment, Sophie looked up at him, her wet eyes searching his face. Then she leaned her head against his chest. The cry didn't stop completely, but it didn't spike either. Naomi smiled faintly. That's better. He glanced at her. Still not as good as you. It's not a competition, she replied. It's a partnership. Alexander absorbed that in silence, rocking gently until Sophie's breathing slowed. He returned her to Naomi reluctantly, surprised at the pang of loss when the baby left his arms. As he stepped out of the nursery, Mrs. Holloway was passing by with a folded stack of laundry. An apology looks good on you, sir, she said without pausing. He raised an eyebrow. You were listening? She didn't answer, just kept walking, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. That night, Alexander worked late in his study, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the morning's exchange. He wasn't sure if he liked being corrected in his own house, but he couldn't deny the results. Naomi Reed was changing things here. And part of him wondered if that was exactly what Sophie, and maybe even he, needed. It happened on a Thursday night. The storm outside had been building since late afternoon, heavy rain battering the tall windows of the grand estate. The wind whistled through the trees, rattling the branches against the glass. Naomi was folding laundry in the living room when she heard it, a sharp, raspy cough from the nursery. She froze. Sophie's cough was small, but there was something in it that made Naomi's chest tighten. She was up the stairs in seconds, her bare feet silent on the carpet. Sophie was sitting in the crib, her cheeks flushed, her breaths short and uneven. "Oh, baby," Naomi whispered, scooping her up. Sophie's forehead was warm, too warm. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a clean blanket, wrapped Sophie snugly, and carried her toward the kitchen where Mrs. Holloway kept the first aid kit. But before she could get there, Alexander appeared in the hallway, fresh from a late meeting, his tie still tight. "What's wrong?" "She's burning up," Naomi said, her voice steady but urgent. "Her breathing's shallow. We need to keep her upright." Alexander stepped forward, reaching for Sophie, but the baby let out a small, distressed cry and clung to Naomi's shirt. Alexander's jaw tightened. "I'll call Dr. Patel." "Do it," Naomi agreed, already heading toward the couch. She sat down, holding Sophie against her chest, rubbing her back in slow circles. The baby's small hands fisted into her blouse, her breathing uneven. Alexander was on the phone, pacing. "Yes, Patel, it's Sophie. Fever and a bad cough." No, she won't let me hold her. She's with the maid. He stopped, glancing at Naomi, then corrected himself. She's with Naomi. We'll keep her comfortable until you arrive. Naomi adjusted Sophie so her head was higher, humming softly under her breath. The sound was almost drowned by the rain hammering the roof, but it seemed to reach Sophie, who leaned closer into the warmth. Minutes dragged like hours until Dr. Patel arrived, shaking off his wet coat. He checked Sophie quickly. It's a viral infection, fever and mild bronchitis. Not dangerous yet, but she needs close monitoring tonight. Keep her upright when she sleeps. Alexander nodded, but Naomi was already arranging a spot on the living room rug. She layered blankets for cushioning, then sat down cross-legged, Sophie in her lap. I'll stay with her here, Naomi said. She sleeps better if she feels someone right next to her. Alexander frowned. You don't have to. I'm not leaving her, Naomi said simply. The hours passed slowly. Sophie would drift off for 10 or 15 minutes, then wake coughing, clinging to Naomi's arm. Naomi held her through each cycle, never moving more than she had to. Around midnight, Alexander returned from his study, loosened tie, no jacket. He stopped at the edge of the rug. Naomi was still sitting there, Sophie's tiny body curled against her. You're going to hurt your back? He said quietly. She's calm, Naomi replied without looking up. That's all that matters. For the first time that night, Alexander really looked at her. She was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, hair pulled back loosely, but her focus never wavered from the baby in her arms. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending up a warm crackle of sparks. Without saying anything, Alexander walked over to the linen closet and returned with a thick wool blanket. He unfolded it and draped it over Naomi's shoulders and Sophie's small legs. Naomi glanced up in brief surprise. Thank you. He nodded once, then lowered himself onto the rug beside them. They sat in silence, the only sounds the storm outside and Sophie's slow, uneven breaths. At some point, Alexander realized he'd been watching the two of them for several minutes. Naomi's steady hand rubbing small circles on Sophie's back, the way the baby's fingers clutched at her as if she were the only safe place in the world. And for reasons he couldn't quite name, Alexander didn't leave. By dawn, Sophie's fever had begun to break. She was still asleep when Naomi finally leaned her head back against the couch, her eyes closing for the first time all night. Alexander rose quietly, pulled the blanket higher over them, and stood there for a long moment before turning away. For the first time, he wondered if Naomi Reed wasn't just keeping his daughter safe. Maybe she was holding together something he didn't even realize was falling apart. The following afternoon, the house was quiet. Sophie was napping in the nursery, the faint hum of the baby monitor coming from the kitchen counter. Alexander stood in the doorway, sipping black coffee, scanning a few emails on his phone. He was about to return to his office when he heard voices from the far end of the hall. Mrs. Holloway's low, measured tone carried just enough to reach him. She doesn't say much about it, but I can tell she's been through a lot, Mrs. Holloway said. Naomi's voice followed, soft but firm. It's in the past. I don't see any point in dragging it out. It shapes who you are, Mrs. Holloway replied. And why you're so good with Sophie. Alexander stepped closer, careful to stay out of sight. Naomi let out a short laugh. Not the amused kind, but the kind that covered something heavier. I grew up with nothing. Foster homes, shelters. The kind of places where you learn quick that comfort is temporary. Mrs. Holloway's voice softened. And the baby? I used to volunteer in a daycare near the shelter. The babies cried a lot. Not because they were hungry, but because no one had the time to just hold them. Naomi's words slowed. I promised myself that if I was ever trusted with a child, I'd never let them cry alone. There was a pause. Mrs. Holloway said quietly, You keep that promise every night. Alexander's fingers tightened slightly around his coffee cup. He'd assumed Naomi's skill with Sophie came from natural instinct or training. But this was something else entirely. Naomi continued, her tone more guarded now. People think being poor makes you desperate. Sometimes it just makes you careful. Careful with people. Careful with trust. Is that why you took this job? Mrs. Holloway asked. I took this job because I needed the work, Naomi answered plainly. But I stayed because she needed me. Alexander felt a strange pull at those words. It wasn't just duty for her, it was personal. Before he could think better of it, he stepped into the room. Naomi looked up, startled for just a second before masking it. Mrs. Holloway turned, her expression unreadable. I didn't mean to interrupt, Alexander said, though they all knew he had heard more than he was admitting. Naomi straightened a stack of folded blankets. We were just talking. I gathered, he replied. He hesitated, then added, I didn't realize you'd worked in shelters. Naomi gave a small shrug. It's not something I lead with. Mrs. Holloway glanced between them. Mr. Grant, Naomi has a way with people who've been through hard things. She understands them. Alexander nodded slowly. I can see that. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the rain easing outside. Finally, Naomi excused herself to check on Sophie, leaving Alexander and Mrs. Holloway alone. She's not just doing a job, sir, Mrs. Holloway said quietly. She's giving Sophie something most people can't, security that doesn't vanish when the lights go out. Alexander didn't answer. He simply set his empty cup on the counter and walked toward his study. But the image of Naomi, sitting on the nursery floor with Sophie sleeping in her arms, stayed with him the rest of the day. Morning came with a pale, forgiving light. The storm had rinsed the estate clean. Wet pines glittered, and the long drive shone like slate. In the kitchen, the espresso machine hissed. Mrs. Holloway moved with quiet certainty, setting out a silver tray, 2 coffees, a small pitcher of steamed milk, a rack of toast, butter in a porcelain dish that looked too delicate for ordinary use. Naomi stood at the counter, checking Sophie's temperature with the temporal thermometer. 98.7, she murmured, relieved. Sophie blinked up from Naomi's hip, a little hoarse but curious, a thumb tucked in the corner of her mouth. Better, Mrs. Holloway said, approving with a nod. You both need food. Before Naomi could answer, Alexander appeared in the doorway. He was in a dark sweater instead of a suit, sleeves pushed to his forearms, hair slightly damp from a shower. The change made him look younger and somehow more human. How is she? He asked. Fever's down, Naomi said. She's still a bit rattly, so upright naps today. And liquids. Alexander stepped closer to Sophie. Hey, Peanut. He touched her foot through the sleep sack, tentative. Sophie did not shy away. She regarded him solemnly, then tried to seize his watch. Naomi shifted her weight. I'll make her oatmeal. Join me in the breakfast room, Alexander said, surprising himself as much as them. He glanced at Mrs. Holloway. Set 3 places. Mrs. Holloway arched an eyebrow, just enough for him to register it, then nodded. Yes, sir. Naomi hesitated. Staff didn't eat with employers, not in houses like this. It wasn't a written rule. It didn't have to be. Still, she followed, because Sophie was reaching toward the light-splashed sunroom, and because something in Alexander's tone wasn't command so much as request, unpracticed and awkward. The breakfast room overlooked the east lawn. Sun pooled across the glass table. A vase of white ranunculus glowed like small moons. Naomi settled Sophie into the high chair. The child thumped the tray with soft, decisive palms. Alexander poured coffee. The ritual steadied his hands. Milk? He offered. Please, Naomi said. He slid the cup toward her. Thank you, for last night. You already said it, Naomi replied, stirring once. But you're welcome. He buttered toast with an unnecessary focus, then set the knife down. I want to discuss something that isn't. He gestured toward the ceiling, toward the invisible domain of nurseries and night feeds. This. Naomi waited. There's a project I fund through the foundation, he said. We're rebuilding an old municipal center on the south side into a hub for caregivers, childcare, legal aid, resource matching. The team is capable. He paused. But they're missing something. People, Naomi said. Perspective, he countered, then conceded, which is to say, people. Sophie smacked the tray approvingly, as if seconding the motion. Naomi tore a small piece of toast, dipped it in cooled oatmeal, and offered it to the baby. Sophie accepted with grave enthusiasm. "You want me to consult?" Naomi said, not a question. "I want you to help me make it real," Alexander said. "Not glossy. Not a photo op that photographs well and serves no one." Naomi kept her gaze on Sophie's small mouth. "I mop floors. I hold babies. I can't sit in those rooms and nod at acronyms I don't understand." "Good," Alexander said. "I don't need another nod. I need someone who will tell me when we're solving the wrong problem." Naomi slid another bite toward Sophie. "Who told you it's the wrong problem?" "Results," he said, leaning back. The pilot site handed out pamphlets. The waiting room stayed full. The door didn't swing any faster. "So you want the door to swing," Naomi said. "You want velocity." "I want mothers to leave with more than flyers," he said, meeting her eyes. "I want them to leave with an appointment, a voucher, a call scheduled, a path." Naomi took a sip of coffee, considering. "What made you think of me?" His answer came without armor. "Last night you built a path. It wasn't complicated. It was consistent." He tapped the table softly. "Regulation." She almost smiled. "You were listening." "I'm learning," he said. Mrs. Holloway set down a plate of scrambled eggs, pretended not to hear the unfamiliar gentleness in the room, and retreated like a stagehand exiting between scenes. Naomi fed Sophie again. "If I say yes, I need rules." "Name them." "I won't be your headline," she said. "I won't be your human interest angle. I won't smile for cameras while you announce, 'The maid who cares.'" "Agreed," Alexander said instantly. "I'm there as a voice," Naomi continued. "Not a prop. If I say something you don't like, you don't bury it in polite minutes." "Agreed," he said again. "You can co-sign the minutes." "And Sophie comes first," Naomi finished. "If she needs me, I walk out of any meeting, no apologies." He glanced at the child, who was smearing oatmeal on the tray like an abstract painter at work. "Agreed." Naomi wiped Sophie's fingers, then looked up. "One more." Alexander waited. "You don't call what I do a favor. You compensate it as work." His mouth tipped, almost a smile. "You'll invoice me. And you'll set your rate." Naomi blinked, perhaps the only sign of surprise he'd earned since she stepped into this house. "All right," she said. "Then I'll try one meeting." He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Today," he said, catching himself. "If you're willing. The team comes at 11. "I thought," he faltered, then finished like a man testing unfamiliar ground, "you'd be more comfortable on home turf." Naomi's gaze flicked to Sophie, to the sunlit lawn, to the hallway that led to the nursery and its soft, humming machines. "Home isn't about turf," she said. "But yes, here is better." At 10 to 11, the den transformed. The long console became a table for printouts. A whiteboard on wheels appeared, its corners dented from battles at previous sites. Alexander's assistant dialed in 2 team members on video. The doorbell chimed. Voices. Footsteps. Purpose. Naomi stood by the window, Sophie on her hip, watching the strangers assemble. A woman with bright, attentive eyes introduced herself as Miriam, program director. A logistics lead named Dev looked at the floor plan and frowned. "We're bottlenecking at intake." "That's because you made intake a desk," Naomi said. Dev blinked. What?" Naomi shifted Sophie to her other hip. "You built a counter. A line forms. People queue. It tells them they're a number before you've even asked their name." Miriam leaned forward. "What would you do?" "Circles," Naomi said. "Chairs in circles. Stagger your start times. Intake isn't a gate, it's a conversation. If they fill out a form alone, you'll never learn the thing they're actually scared to say." Alexander watched the room tip toward her. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Dev recovered. "We're trying to move volume." "So move differently," Naomi replied. "Put a toddler mat in one corner. Put a kettle in the other." She nodded at the scone plate Mrs. Holloway had supply dropped like a seasoned quartermaster. "If you want a woman to hear you, feed her something warm." Miriam scribbled. "What about follow-up?" We're losing people between visit 1 and 2. Because you hand them a phone number, Naomi said. And half of them don't have minutes left after the 15th. Schedule the call while they're in the room. Put their name on the whiteboard and don't erase it until someone has eyes on outcomes. The room hummed. Practicality had a sound. It was pencils against paper, keyboards accepting commands. On the screen, a remote team member named Carla, herself a former shelter advocate, judging by how quickly she tracked details, spoke up. If we asked you to walk the space with us next week? You'll walk it now, Naomi said, gentle but immovable. On paper. Tape measures come later. Alexander cleared his throat. We'll fund the tape measures. Miriam smiled. Noted. Sophie began to fuss. Naomi bounced her lightly, a small rhythm absent nervousness. Upright nap, she murmured. We'll stroll. Then to the room, keep talking. I'm listening. They kept talking. Alexander listened too, but in the space where he usually filled silence with strategy, something quieter took root. It felt like the first useful stillness he'd had in months. By noon, the whiteboard wore a new architecture, soft entry, human triage, on-site scheduling, a hot drink cart as policy. It looked nothing like a grant application and everything like a place where people might actually exhale. Miriam capped the marker. If we implement this in 6 weeks, will you come to the opening? She asked Naomi. I'll come to Tuesday, Naomi said. Openings are for cameras. Tuesdays are for proof. Miriam laughed, delighted. Fair. When the team filtered out, the room exhaled. Naomi laid Sophie against her shoulder, palm cupping the little back, small circles again, her signature, her cipher. The baby's breath steadied into that soft, rasping half-sleep of recovery. Alexander stepped nearer. You were, he searched for a word that wasn't condescension dressed as compliment. Effective. Naomi raised an eyebrow. So were they? They just needed permission to build for people instead of plans. He nodded. Will you keep going? Yes, she said. With the rules in place. They are, he answered. And one more. She waited. If you ever feel I'm using your story where your work should stand, you tell me and I stop. He held her gaze. Not later. Not after the article runs. Then. A long beat. Then Naomi said, That's a good rule. He half smiled. I'm learning. Mrs. Holloway reappeared as if summoned by the word learning, which in this house often meant someone needed a sandwich. Chicken salad, she announced, setting down plates. She glanced at Alexander's sweater, at the whiteboard, at the sleeping baby. I see civilization broke out in the den. Briefly, Naomi said. Try to keep it, Mrs. Holloway replied. Then to Alexander, in a lower tone only almost a whisper, You did well. He looked vaguely surprised. I didn't do much. Precisely, she said and left them to their lunch. They ate at the console, plates balanced on the edge, because formality would have shattered the spell. Through the glass, the lawns brightened, and somewhere a groundskeeper started a mower, the afternoon's ordinary music. When they were done, Naomi shifted Sophie without waking her and rose. I'm putting her down in the rocker. If she stirs, I'll be upstairs. Alexander nodded. Naomi. She paused. Thank you, he said, for making it real. She studied him a moment, as if measuring not just the words but the man who'd chosen them. Make it stay, she said. That's the only thanks that counts. She left him with the whiteboard and the echo of her terms. He looked at the lines and arrows, the ordinary genius of chairs and circles, of kettles and toddler mats, of names that did not get erased. Then he reached for his phone, opened his calendar, and moved a standing investor call off the page. Some projects needed more than money. They needed him to learn how not to be the loudest person in the room. He could start today. He could start here. And in the quiet after that decision, for the first time in a long time, Alexander Grant felt the smallest, and therefore most dangerous, of luxuries, hope. The next morning began without a storm, without fever, without the sharp edge of crisis. Sophie woke early, babbling in the monitor, not crying, just experimenting with sound. Naomi padded into the nursery in socks, hair tied back, the faintest hint of a smile at the corners of her mouth. "Good morning, Chatterbox," she murmured. Sophie reached up immediately, fingers curling into Naomi's shirt as she was lifted from the crib. Downstairs, Mrs. Holloway was already preparing breakfast. "Eggs are on the stove," she said. "And your boss," she inclined her head toward the den, "has been up since 6. Alexander's voice carried faintly through the open double doors. "No, I don't want another feasibility report. We have the plan. What we need now is to act." Naomi settled Sophie into the high chair, giving her a soft toy to occupy her hands. When Alexander ended the call and stepped into the kitchen, he looked different again, still dressed in a crisp shirt and tailored trousers, but without the hurried tension she'd seen before. "Morning," he said. "Morning," Naomi replied. He glanced at Sophie, then at Naomi. "The team couldn't stop talking about your suggestions yesterday. Miriam sent over a draft of the revised layout. Wants you to look it over before they finalize." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "And you want me to what? Approve it?" "I want you to tell them if it works in reality," Alexander said. "Not on paper." Sophie squealed, smacking her toy against the tray. Alexander reached over to steady it, earning a curious look from the baby. Naomi watched, not saying anything. "I was thinking," Alexander continued, "if you're willing, you could come to the site with me today. See it for yourself." Naomi hesitated. "What about Sophie?" "She comes," Alexander said simply. "If she gets tired, we come home. No one will complain, least of all me." Mrs. Holloway chuckled as she slid a plate of eggs onto the counter. "You'll scare the board with this family-first talk, Mr. Grant." Alexander gave her a look, but there was no real heat in it. By 9, the three of them were in the SUV, Alexander driving, Naomi in the back with Sophie in a rear-facing seat. The baby seemed fascinated by the passing world, trees bending in the wind, buses hissing to a stop, people crossing streets with coffees in hand. The Southside Center was still in the early stages of renovation. The brick exterior bore the faded lettering of its municipal past, but scaffolding climbed one wall and the front doors stood open. Inside, the smell of sawdust and fresh paint mingled with the cool draft of autumn air. Miriam was already there, along with a few construction crew members and Dev, clipboard in hand. "Naomi," Miriam said warmly, "just in time. We've taped out the new layout. Want to walk you through it." Naomi stepped onto the bare concrete floor, Sophie on her hip, and followed the bright blue painter's tape that outlined spaces where walls, seating, and counters would go. "This," Miriam said, pointing to a large open area near the entrance, "is the circle seating you suggested. We'll have 3 of them here, here, and here. The intake desks will be off to the side, not the front." Naomi nodded, picturing it filled with voices, children's laughter, maybe even a kettle in the corner. "And here," Dev said, leading them toward a far wall, "is where we're adding the toddler mat area, soft flooring, toys, low shelves." Sophie wriggled in Naomi's arms as if volunteering to test it out. "Looks good," Naomi said, "but make sure it's visible from the seating area. If a parent has to crane their neck or leave the circle to see their kid, they won't relax." Miriam scribbled a note. Alexander stayed a few steps behind, hands in his pockets, letting Naomi speak without interruption. Watching her move through the space, he saw how naturally people adjusted to her observations. No defensiveness, just the quiet recognition of sense when they heard it. When they reached a corner marked for the resource counter, Naomi frowned. "What's this?" "Information hub," Dev said. "We'll post flyers, forms, updates." "No," Naomi said, shaking her head. "Put that stuff where people will see it on their way out, not when they're coming in. If you hit them with paperwork before they even sit down, you're telling them to read before you've listened." Miriam immediately crossed out a note. She's right. They spent the next hour walking every taped outline, adjusting here, adding there. Sophie grew restless toward the end, and Alexander surprised himself by taking her without hesitation. She fit awkwardly at first, her small legs sticking out against his forearm, but after a minute she relaxed, thumb finding her mouth. "You've got her," Naomi said, watching. "I think she's got me," Alexander replied. By the time they left, The crew had a new set of instructions, and Miriam had invited Naomi to the next 2 planning sessions. "You're part of the team now," she said, handing Naomi a hard hat with a smile. In the car, Sophie dozed in her seat, the lull of the road keeping her eyes closed. "You were right," Alexander said finally. "About what?" "About the circles. The kettle. The whole thing. It's not complicated, but it's different. It feels alive." Naomi shrugged. "People just need to feel seen. Everything else follows." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Maybe that applies here too." She met his eyes briefly, then looked away. "Maybe." When they returned to the estate, Mrs. Holloway was waiting at the door. "How was it?" "Productive," Alexander said. Naomi adjusted Sophie in her arms. "First step's done. Now we see if it leads anywhere." Mrs. Holloway smiled knowingly. "With the right steps, it will." Naomi didn't answer, but as she carried Sophie upstairs for her nap, she allowed herself the smallest flicker of belief that maybe, just maybe, she was building something more than a temporary job here. It started quietly, just whispers in the background, the kind you almost ignore. 2 days after the site visit, Naomi noticed a shift in the way one of the gardeners avoided eye contact when she passed. Later, Mrs. Holloway mentioned that Monica, a former maid Alexander had fired months ago, had been seen around the neighborhood. "She's been talking to anyone who'll listen," Mrs. Holloway said, lowering her voice. "Saying, we're trying to replace Sophie's mother." Naomi's stomach sank. "That's ridiculous." "Of course it is," Mrs. Holloway agreed. "But you know how these things go. One person whispers, another repeats it, and soon it's truth to someone who wants to believe it." That afternoon, as Naomi carried Sophie into the kitchen, she caught the tail end of a phone call from Alexander. "Yes, I heard." "No, I don't want this turning into gossip fodder. Just handle it." He ended the call and looked at Naomi. "What's going on?" she asked. He hesitated. "It's nothing you need to worry about." "If it's about me, I think I do." Alexander set his phone down, expression guarded. "Monica's been saying things. To the staff. To a few people on the board." Naomi shifted Sophie to her other hip. "What kind of things?" "That you're trying to insert yourself as Sophie's mother. That you're overstepping." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "And you believe her?" His pause was brief but enough. "I think perception matters. If people start thinking." She cut him off, her voice sharper than usual. "If people start thinking what? That Sophie's happier? That she sleeps through the night now? That she clings to me because I'm here when she wakes up?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Naomi." "No," she said, stepping closer. "I have done nothing but care for your daughter and respect the boundaries you set. If you want to question that, fine. But don't stand there and tell me it's about perception. This is about trust." Sophie whimpered softly, sensing the tension. Naomi took a breath, forcing her tone down. "You can't run a charity for children and doubt the one person actually holding your own child when she cries." The words landed harder than she intended. Alexander's gaze flickered, but he said nothing. That night, Sophie was unsettled. She tossed in her crib, waking every hour. Naomi stayed in the nursery, rocking her back to sleep each time. By dawn, she was running on almost no rest. When Alexander came to check on them, Sophie reached for him but clung to Naomi at the same time, her little arms tight. "She's picking up on this," Mrs. Holloway said from the doorway. "Children know when the adults around them are at odds. It rattles them." Alexander looked at Naomi. "I don't want this to get worse." "Then fix it," she said quietly. "Because right now, you're the one letting her feel unsafe." It happened 3 nights later. The house was silent, the kind of deep quiet that made the ticking of the hallway clock sound louder than it should. Alexander was in his study, a half-finished glass of scotch beside his laptop, when it broke, Sophie's cry. Not the restless whimper of a baby between dreams. This was sharper. Frightened. He was on his feet instantly, moving down the hall. The nursery door was ajar, a faint light spilling into the corridor. Inside, Naomi was already there, sitting on the floor with Sophie in her lap. The baby's face was pressed into her shoulder, Tiny fingers knotted in the fabric of Naomi's t-shirt. "It's all right, sweetheart," Naomi murmured, her voice steady, like she'd said it 1,000 times before. "You're safe. I've got you." Alexander stepped inside quietly. "What happened?" "Nightmare," Naomi said without looking up. "She was shaking when I got here." He crouched down, seeing the way Sophie's breathing was still uneven. Naomi rubbed her back in slow, deliberate circles, her head bent close. The sight was so natural, so uncalculated, it made him feel like an intruder in his own home. "You've been here since?" he asked. "Since the first cry," Naomi replied. "She doesn't settle if I put her down too soon." For a long moment, Alexander just watched. The clock on the wall ticked on. Sophie's eyes finally fluttered closed, her little body relaxing fully into Naomi's arms. "I owe you an apology," he said suddenly. Naomi glanced at him, wary. "For what?" "For doubting you. For listening to Monica, even for a second. For forgetting that actions speak louder than rumors." She looked back at Sophie. "I'm not here to take anyone's place, Alexander. I'm here because she needs someone who won't leave in the middle of the night." Her words hit harder than he expected. He realized, with an uncomfortable pang, that she wasn't just talking about Sophie. "I see that now," he said quietly. Naomi shifted Sophie gently and stood, careful not to wake her. She laid the baby back in the crib, pulling the blanket up just enough. Sophie didn't stir. Alexander followed her into the hall. "Naomi." She stopped, turning to face him. "I don't want this house to be a place where you have to prove yourself every day," he said. "Not to me, not to anyone. You've already done more for Sophie than I can measure." Naomi's shoulders eased slightly, but her voice remained calm. "Then let's keep the focus on her. That's all I've ever wanted." He nodded. "Agreed." Mrs. Holloway appeared at the end of the hall, holding a folded blanket. "Everything all right?" Naomi gave a small nod. "Yes. She's sleeping now." As they all headed toward their rooms, Alexander found himself glancing back at the nursery door. The house felt different. Not warmer exactly, but less hollow. And for the first time since Rachel's passing, he didn't feel like Sophie's well-being was balancing on a knife's edge. The first sign was small enough to ignore. A delivery of toddler mats never arrived at the South Side site. Dev checked the order history and frowned at his tablet. "It shows delivered 2 days ago." "They aren't here," Miriam said, scanning the empty corner where the play area should have been. "We can't open without them." Naomi crouched by the taped outline, Sophie strapped to her chest in a sling, thumb tucked in her mouth. "Who signed for them?" Dev scrolled. "V. Lang." "I don't know A.V. Lang on our crew." Miriam did. Her mouth flattened. "Victor Lang. Board liaison. He's the one who insists on reviewing all purchase orders." Naomi straightened. "Then we start there." By noon, a second sign appeared. 2 invoices for the same electrical work, identical scope, different vendor names. One legit contractor Naomi had met on site. One nobody recognized. Alexander arrived in a dark coat, hair ruffled by the wind. He took one look at the faces in the room. "Tell me." Miriam handed him the clipboard. "Double billing. Missing mats. And the fire suppression permit just hit a delay that will cost another week." "Who approved the change orders?" Alexander asked. "Victor," Miriam said. "He told me he had discretion from the board to keep things moving." Alexander's jaw went hard. Discretion isn't embezzlement. Naomi took the clipboard, scanning the line items with the alertness of someone used to catching small things before they became big ones. These vendor names, Hanover Logistics and Blue Pine Solutions. They share a P.O. box. Dev blinked. "How did you?" "People who steal rarely bother to steal new habits," Naomi said. "They reuse addresses." Alexander's gaze cut to her. "What do you need?" "Access," Naomi said, "to the vendor onboarding forms, the sign-in logs, and the building's camera footage for the loading dock." Miriam nodded toward the site office. "We can get the logs." "Cameras?" "That's building management." Alexander pulled out his phone. "I'll get it." 2 calls later, He had a link to the last month of doc footage and an admin login. Dev fetched the paper logs. Miriam printed the vendor packets. They set up on a folding table. Coffee appeared by magic courtesy of a runner who recognized crisis when he saw one. Naomi strapped Sophie into a portable rocker and set it near the table. The baby watched the adults with solemn curiosity as Naomi worked. She sorted the invoices by date and amount, circled PO numbers, and linked them to entries in the sign-in book with a cheap ballpoint pen. It was methodical, nothing glamorous, just consistency applied. "Here," she said, sliding a stack toward Alexander. "Every duplicate invoice routes through Victor's expedite email. He sends it to accounting after hours with board authorized in the subject line. That bypasses Miriam's approval." Miriam exhaled. "He told accounting I'd signed off." "He also told them to CC an address that doesn't exist," Naomi added. Miriam.program at a domain missing one letter. "You never saw the CC bounce." Dev whistled softly. "That's surgical." "Sloppy," Naomi corrected, tapping the vendor address. "Look at the PO box again." Alexander clicked the camera feed link and dragged to a Tuesday evening. The loading dock sprang to life in grainy grayscale. "Playbacks start at 1800, he said. They watched a hand truck unload sealed cartons labeled Toddler Mat, 8 of them. A man signed a clipboard. The camera angle was bad, catching only his shoulder and hand. The digital time stamp read 1842. "Zoom?" Miriam asked. Alexander zoomed until the pixels smeared. Still, they could make out the receiver's initials on the signature line, VIL. "Captured," Alexander said. "Where'd they go?" Naomi rewound 10 minutes. The same hand truck rolled the cartons through the dock, and then out another exit that led to the alley. 2 minutes later, a panel van with magnetic decals, Hanover Logistics, pulled up. The boxes went in. The van left. Miriam stared. He checked in the delivery, then moved it back out with a fake vendor. "Creates a valid, delivered record for the books," Naomi said. "Then bills us again later with blue pine." Sophie fussed. Naomi rocked the baby's chair with her foot and kept working. "Check the vendor packets." Dev flipped the pages. Hanover lists a contact named Greg Knoll. Cell number has no voicemail set up. Blue Pine lists G. Knoll with the same number, different last digit. "Throwaway prepaid," Alexander said flatly. Naomi circled the address line. "P.O. Box is 1 digit off on Blue Pine's W9. But if you put both boxes in a duffel and walk to the counter at the same branch, nobody asks questions." Alexander's phone buzzed. "A text from legal. Do you want us to freeze the project dispersals?" He typed back, "Not yet. Give me 2 hours." He looked at Naomi. "If we pull the plug now, he'll smell it and cover tracks." "Then we don't pull," Naomi said. "We trap." "How?" Dev asked. "Bait invoice," Naomi said. "Small enough to be routine, urgent enough for Victor to push. We send it from a real vendor for a restock fee on mats, something he thinks he can divert. We put a unique tracking serial in the line description. If he routes it through Blue Pine, we have direct link." Miriam's eyes lit. "I'll call our real supplier. They'll draft a legitimate restock quote with the serial." Alexander nodded. "I'll make accounting hold any invoice with that serial unless it comes through your approval." "And we watch the doc," Naomi said. "He'll need to show a replacement delivery to justify payment. We'll be there with the camera and security." 2 hours later, the stage was set. Miriam's supplier sent a quote with the serial code SPKettle 117 buried in the description. Accounting sent the purchase order to the general queue. Within 30 minutes, Victor forwarded it after hours to Expedite, CNG the bogus address, and stamped it board authorized. "Got him," Dev said. "Not yet," Naomi said. "We need the motion." They left 2 small site cams trained on the dock and the side exit. Alexander called building security and arranged for 2 guards to be on break near the loading area, radios on silent. He didn't put anything in writing. At 7:09 p.m., a Hanover van rolled up. 2 men in caps started unloading 3 cartons labeled with the supplier's logo. Naomi and Alexander watched from the shadow of a storage room, the portable rocker at Naomi's feet. Sophie slept, oblivious. "Wait," Naomi whispered. On the feed, one man wheeled the boxes inside. The other peeled off, circled to the side exit, and propped it with his foot. 2 minutes later, the same hand truck pushed the boxes back out, this time with the supplier labels facing down. The van idled. "Now," Alexander said into the radio. Security stepped in quietly, no shouting, no theater. IDs were requested. The van's plates were photographed. One man ran. The guard didn't chase, he filmed the retreat. Victor appeared at the end of the corridor, suit jacket on but tie loosened, holding his phone like a shield. "What's going on?" Alexander walked toward him with the calm of a man who had decided he was done apologizing for being decisive. "Delivery verification," he said. "Stay where you are." Victor waved the phone. "I'll call the board." "You'll call nobody," Alexander said, still even. He gestured to Naomi. "Show him." Victor's face went pale, then hot. "You don't understand how these projects work." "I understand theft," Alexander said. "I understand you used my foundation to launder your greed." "Careful," Victor said. "Allegations. Evidence," Naomi said softly. "Words are for rumors. Pictures are for court." Victor swallowed. "We can settle this internally." "No," Alexander said. "We'll settle it legally." Security escorted the installers to a holding area to await the police. The van pulled away, but not fast enough to avoid the second camera at the gate capturing its plates cleanly. Miriam, who had arrived at a run when the text came through, stood with her hands on her hips, shaking with a mix of fury and relief. "Are we shut down?" she asked. "Briefly," Alexander said. "For the right reasons." Victor tried one last angle. "You freeze funding, you tank your own timeline. The press will love that story." "I'll tell them a better one," Alexander said. "How we chose integrity over speed." He turned to Naomi. "Get Sophie home," he said quietly. "I'll handle the rest." Naomi shook her head. "We finish together." He looked at her for a beat, then nodded. Paperwork followed, the kind that felt heavier than paper. Security statements. Chain of custody summaries for the footage. Miriam wrote a clear incident report. Dev cross-referenced every suspicious PO and flagged them for legal. By 9, the site was quiet again. Naomi lifted Sophie, who stretched and blinked, then resettled against her shoulder. Alexander locked the dock door himself, the key turning with a final click that felt like a line drawn. Outside, the air was colder. Their breath showed. In the dark lot, under a buzzing sodium light, Alexander spoke without looking away from the building. "Thank you," he said. Naomi adjusted Sophie's blanket. "Make it stay," she said, echoing her words from the day before. "Cut the rot, not just the branch." "It will hurt," he said. "Things worth keeping usually do," she replied. "But when you open those doors, it needs to be clean." He exhaled. "Tomorrow, we brief legal and the board. Full transparency. Then we get back to work." Naomi nodded once. "And you tell the crew we believe them. People need to hear that after they've been used as cover." He glanced at her. "Come with me to the board meeting." "As a voice," she said. "Not a prop." "As a partner," he corrected. She didn't answer with words, only shifted Sophie higher and started toward the car. He followed. Behind them, the building stood quiet, taped lines still marking circles on concrete. If you squinted, you could almost see the chairs, the kettle, the Tuesday that would come. But first, they had to clear the doorway. The press conference was Alexander's idea. The timing was Naomi's. "If you wait until the board spins it," she told him the night before, "you'll be reacting instead of leading. Take the first step." Now, less than 24 hours later, the ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation's headquarters was packed wall to wall, reporters, cameras, foundation staff, and a handful of city officials who'd come to observe. The story had leaked, but only in the vaguest terms: project delay, internal review. People wanted answers. Alexander stood behind the podium, flanked by Miriam and Naomi. Sophie was at home with Mrs. Holloway, Today was about words and proof, not soothing a baby. The chatter died the moment he approached the mic. "Good afternoon," he began, voice steady. "This won't be a long speech. It will be a clear one." He glanced at Naomi before continuing. "The Southside Children's Center is a promise I made to this city. A place where every child, regardless of where they were born or how much money their parents make, can feel safe and valued. That promise was attacked, not by strangers, but from inside our own operation." A ripple of murmurs moved through the room. Cameras clicked. "In the past month," Alexander went on, "funds allocated for construction and supplies were diverted through a fraudulent scheme involving duplicate invoices, shell vendors, and falsified delivery records. This was not a misunderstanding. It was theft." He nodded toward a large monitor to his left. The screen lit up with still frames from the dock footage Naomi had pulled, cartons arriving, being signed for, then leaving again minutes later. The initials VL on the signature line. The same boxes reappearing under a fake vendor's name. "This," Alexander said, pointing at the images, "is what theft looks like." A reporter in the second row called out, "Who's responsible?" Alexander didn't hesitate. Victor Lang, acting as board liaison for the project, abused his position and authority to carry out this scheme. As of this morning, he has been removed from all foundation duties, pending legal action. The matter has been referred to law enforcement with full cooperation from our team. More murmurs, sharper this time. Naomi kept her eyes on the crowd, reading faces like she was taking inventory. She could spot the ones who were here for the truth and the ones who were here for the headline. Alexander shifted slightly, making room for her. "The person who uncovered this scheme and prevented further damage is standing beside me. She is not a financial analyst. She is not a lawyer. She is Sophie's caretaker, Naomi Reed. She noticed the missing mats, questioned the invoices, and refused to ignore small inconsistencies. She reminded me and this entire organization that integrity is not a department. It's a choice we make every day." He stepped back. Naomi blinked at him, clearly not expecting to speak, but the mic was now hers. She leaned in just enough for her voice to carry. "I'm not here for applause," she said simply. "I'm here to say that if you see something wrong and you have the ability to speak up, you should. No matter your title. No matter how small the detail seems." She glanced at Alexander, then back at the crowd. "And if you're in charge, make it safe for people to tell you the truth. Even if it's inconvenient. Especially then." There was a pause, then a wave of camera flashes. The first question came fast. "Ms. Reed, did you feel your position in the household was at risk by coming forward?" "Yes," Naomi said without hesitation. "But Sophie's well-being mattered more than my job security. And if you work for someone who punishes honesty, you're already in the wrong place." Alexander's gaze flicked over the crowd, challenging anyone to contradict her. Another reporter stood. "Mr. Grant, how will this affect the timeline of the Children's Center?" Alexander didn't sugarcoat it. "We'll be delayed by 3 weeks. That's the cost of replacing stolen materials, re-auditing all accounts, and resecuring our supply chain. It's a cost worth paying. We won't open the doors until I can look every child in the eye and know this building was built honestly." Miriam stepped forward with a stack of documents. "For full transparency," she said, "we're posting all vendor lists, invoices, and project audits on the Foundation website today. Any member of the public can view them. We welcome scrutiny." Hands shot up. Questions came rapid-fire, some about oversight reforms, some about Victor Lang's history, some about whether this scandal would impact Alexander's personal reputation. Naomi answered only when asked directly. Alexander handled the rest with a bluntness that surprised even his longtime staff. "If my reputation takes a hit because I chose transparency over silence," he said, "that's a hit I'll accept. But I won't accept being the kind of man who looks away." By the time the conference ended, social media was already buzzing. Clips of Naomi speaking, her calm tone, her unpolished sincerity, were spreading faster than the board's official press release. Hashtags with her name appeared alongside photos of the dock footage. Outside, as the last of the cameras were packed away, Alexander and Naomi stepped into the crisp air. You didn't warn me you'd hand me the mic, she said. You wouldn't have agreed if I had, he replied. She gave him a sideways look. Manipulation isn't a great trait in a boss. Maybe not, he said, but in this case it worked. They reached the waiting car. Before getting in, Alexander paused. Naomi, about earlier, when you said leaders should make it safe to tell them the truth. That hit me harder than you know. Then do something with it, she said. Make it part of the job description. He nodded slowly. I will. As the car pulled away, Naomi looked out at the city. Somewhere, Sophie was napping in the safety of Mrs. Holloway's arms. Somewhere else, contractors would soon be unloading legitimate deliveries for the center. And for the first time, Naomi allowed herself to believe the promise might actually hold. The garden had always been Rachel's pride, rows of roses, ivy climbing the trellis, and a stone bench tucked beneath the willow tree. Since her passing, Alexander had avoided it. Too many memories. But that afternoon, he found himself walking the path without thinking, drawn by the sound of quiet laughter. Naomi was there, sitting on the bench with Sophie curled in her lap. The baby's head rested against her chest, a small blanket draped over both of them. Naomi's shoes were off, toes in the grass. She was reading from a worn children's book, her voice low and soothing. Sophie was asleep before the second page. Alexander stood for a moment, just watching. The sunlight filtered through the willow branches, laying soft shadows across the two of them. It was a picture so complete, so natural, it made something shift in him. A realization that the house hadn't felt this alive in years. You're in my spot, he said gently, stepping closer. Naomi looked up, smiling faintly. Then you've been away from it too long. He sat beside her, careful not to jostle Sophie. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rustle of leaves overhead. I've been thinking, Alexander said finally, about what you've done here. Not just with the project. With Sophie. Naomi glanced down at the sleeping child. She's easy to love. She is, he agreed. But you didn't just love her. You showed up. Every time. Even when I doubted you. Even when people tried to turn me against you. Naomi's eyes softened, but her voice stayed even. That's what she needed. Someone who wouldn't leave. He exhaled slowly. I don't want you to be just Sophie's caretaker anymore. She raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? It means I want you here. In this home. In our lives. Not as an employee, but as part of the family. Naomi blinked, caught off guard. Alexander. I'm not asking for an answer right now, he said quickly. I've spent so much time thinking I had to do this alone. That loving someone meant risking losing them. But you've shown me that the risk is worth it. Sophie stirred in Naomi's arms, letting out a soft sigh. Naomi adjusted the blanket, her hands moving with instinctive care. I don't know what that future looks like, Alexander admitted. But I know it's better if you're in it. Naomi studied him for a moment, then looked down at Sophie. I came here to work, Alexander. But somewhere along the way, it stopped feeling like just a job. They sat in silence again, letting the weight of the words settle. From the porch, Mrs. Holloway appeared with a tray, 2 glasses of iced tea and a plate of shortbread. She set it on the garden table without a word, but her smile said she'd heard enough to understand. Naomi laughed quietly. She's going to have opinions about this. She already does, Alexander said, taking a glass. A breeze swept through the garden, carrying the scent of roses. Sophie shifted, eyes fluttering open for a brief moment. She saw Alexander, reached out a tiny hand, then fell back asleep against Naomi's chest. Alexander looked at them, really looked, and felt something he hadn't in a long time. I want her to grow up knowing she's loved by the people in this house, he said. Not just cared for. Loved. Naomi's answer was simple. Then let's make sure she does. They stayed in the garden until the sun dipped low, casting everything in a warm, golden light. When they finally rose to head inside, Alexander reached for Sophie, but Naomi shook her head gently. She's fine where she is, she whispered. He didn't argue. Instead, he walked beside them, one hand lightly on Naomi's back, as they crossed the lawn toward the house. Inside, the air felt different, lighter, warmer, as if the walls themselves recognized the change. And for the first time in years, Alexander didn't feel like he was walking into an empty home. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about love, resilience, and second chances.